Martin Caldwell lived in a small cabin nestled at the edge of a vast forest called Pine Ridge. The cabin was simple and made of weathered wood, with a steep roof to keep the heavy mountain snow from piling up. Windows framed with rough logs gave Martin a clear view of ancient pines that stretched high toward the sky. Some of their branches scratched the cabin walls when strong winds blew through. A thin trail of smoke curled from the stone chimney most mornings, showing that Martin had already built a fire before sunrise. He kept the fire alive even on warm days, because the mountain air was cool and damp at dawn, and it warmed him when he stepped out of bed. Every evening, Martin packed a small bag with the essentials he might need for the following day: a flashlight, a spare flannel shirt, heavy socks, and a canteen filled with water. He also carried a few cans of soup and a loaf of crusty bread. These items were stored in a large wooden chest beside his bed. He believed that in the mountains, it was better to have more supplies than too few. Once he tried to carry fewer things, but a sudden storm had forced him to turn back in the darkness, and he barely made it home before hypothermia set in. From that moment on, he always made sure his cabin was stocked and ready for whatever the weather might bring. By night, Martin worked as a janitor at the local high school. The school stood at the end of a paved road that wound its way through the forest. Lamps lit the parking lot, and tall trees cast flickering shadows as he walked in before midnight. The hallways were dim until he flipped switches that turned on fluorescent lights overhead. His job was quiet and methodical. He emptied trash, bins, cleaned chalkboards, swept the floors, and polished desks until they shone under the bright lights. He moved through empty classrooms with steady steps, humming softly to himself. Sometimes he imagined the students scattered across the world, those who had graduated years before, wondering where they were now. Martin kept his chores simple because he liked order. He found peace in the steady routine. When the cleaning was done, he washed his hands at the sink near the stage in the auditorium and glanced at the crooked paint on the walls. Reminders. That time passed and things aged. He always straightened a chair or two as if that small act mattered. A worn curtain hung behind the stage. He studied its faded fabric each night and thought that one day someone would replace it. But until then, he would keep the dust off the floorboards, readying the stage for any performance the school might host. At dawn, Martin left the school behind and walked back to his cabin. Snowmelt in spring made the dirt road muddy, and he often slipped on hidden rocks. He wore thick boots with good traction to keep his footing sure. On the way, he passed a narrow creek whose water gurgled over smooth stones. He occasionally paused to watch trout dart between shadows beneath a fallen log. The forest came alive early in the morning. Robins flitted between tree limbs, and deer sometimes peeked from behind tall grasses near the roadside. Martin moved slowly so as not to startle them. If he needed to stop, he leaned against his shovel, taking in the cold air and listening to nature wake up. Once home, he gathered around a small wood stove in the living room. He poured hot coffee into a chipped mug and settled into a creaky chair beside the window. The trees outside glittered with dew, and the sun's rays filtered through branches, painting the cabin floor with patches of light. He often thought about those trees as gnarled guardians, each holding stories of years past. In the silence, he remembered his childhood in a nearby town. His parents had moved to the city when he was young, so he stayed behind with his grandparents. They taught him to tend a garden and mend clothes, skills he still used. But after his grandparents passed away, Martin chose to stay in the mountains, feeling they held a special kind of freedom. A few townsfolk knew him as the quiet janitor who kept to himself. They saw him at the general store each Sunday, buying flour, sugar, and sometimes a jar of wild blackberry jam. The clerk waved at him, and Martin offered a polite nod in return. He didn't have close friends in the town, but he respected the people who respected his space. He believed relationships grew slowly, like the sturdy pines around him, roots reaching deep. So he kept social gatherings to a minimum, preferring instead to find company in the wind that rustled leaves or in the crackling of his own fire. Martin's cabin had only one bedroom, a small corner with a simple bed and a quilt his grandmother had sewn. The living room contained an old wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf filled with dog-eared page-turners, adventure novels, nature guides, and books of poetry. He read whenever he had spare time, his eyes traveling across words that reminded him of faraway places or stirred thoughts about life and solitude. By mid-morning, he sometimes walked to the forest edge, leaning his shovel against a tree and picking a path among tangled underbrush. He would sit on a moss-covered rock and breathe deeply, trying to hear something beyond his own heartbeat. Spring storms in the mountains were quick to arrive and swift to depart. In late May, Martin noticed clouds gathering thicker than usual. He checked his radio for any weather updates, but the forecast on his battery-powered device simply said, "Showers likely." From the pattern he knew so well, he sensed that something bigger was coming, so he spent the day preparing wood for the fireplace, ensuring he had enough logs stacked neatly on the porch. He slid extra blankets into a trunk at the foot of his bed, lining them next to his wool coat. Even though the sun still peeked through gaps in the clouds, Martin trusted his instincts, believing the mountains talked to those who listened. The afternoon he tied up his boots and headed back to the high school for another night shift. He carried a windbreaker in his hands, folded neatly, just in case. The road up to the school was lonely and winding. One street lamp flickered and then died, leaving a stretch of darkness where he sometimes imagined eyes glowing from the woods. Though he was unafraid of what lived in the forest, he felt a certain respect, a feeling that nature could be both beautiful and unforgiving. He moved quickly past that spot, focusing on the glow of lights that marked the school. That night, as Martin wiped desks and emptied wastebaskets, the wind began to howl outside. The windows rattled and he paused, listening to the buildup of energy in the air. He thought of the supplies he had stashed away, grateful he hadn't waited until a storm was already raging. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out, entirely. In the darkness, he flipped on his flashlight and continued his rounds by its narrow beam. The usual silence of the school felt heavier, as if the building itself was bracing for something. Martin worked steadily, imagining how the storm would test the strength of the old roof and the tall pine trees that leaned over the schoolyard. By the time he finished, the wind had grown into a fierce gale. He slid on his coat, adjusted the straps of his bag, and stepped into the night. Rain pounded the metal roofs of the classrooms, sending rivulets down walls and into gutters. Martin held his flashlight high, guiding his way along the slick path. He remembered how he had once fallen on a similar night, twisting his ankle and sitting on the cold ground until help arrived. He refused to let that happen again. Keeping his eyes on the ground, he took careful steps toward the cabin, eager to be home where he could stoke the fire and sit beside its warmth. When he finally reached his door, Martin felt more alert than tired, as if the storm had awakened something deep inside him. He closed the heavy wooden door behind him, locking it against the howling wind. Inside, he lit a lantern that cast a warm glow over his few possessions. He fed extra logs into the stove and listened to the next patter of raindrops on the roof. His cabin, though humble, was a haven in that moment, a shelter against the wildness outside. Martin wiped his forehead, sat down near the fire, and allowed himself a small sense of relief. He knew storms could test even his careful preparations, but he trusted that as long as he lived simply and respected the mountains, he would be ready for whatever came. The wind had picked up by the time Martin locked the school doors behind him. Rain pounded the roof like 100 tiny hammers, and the path ahead was already slick with water. Martin held his flashlight steady, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a narrow dirt road lined by tall pine trees. Each step was cautious, since the ground was wet and uneven. Lightning flashed in the sky, briefly illuminating the forest in pale white light. He could hear branches snapping somewhere behind him as the wind forced them downward. Even the usual sounds of nighttime creatures seemed silenced by the storm's roar. Martin gripped the strap of his bag tighter, knowing that every trip home, during a storm, felt like a test of his resolve. He welcomed the idea of the cabin's warmth and safety, but tonight the forest felt more hostile than usual. Halfway along the road, a sudden sound cut through the howling wind. A sharp, frightened cry. Martin froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The cry was human and distinctly urgent. No animal could make that sound. He swallowed and pressed his flashlight higher, focusing on a spot ahead where rain fell in sheets. The cry came again, closer this time, and he realized someone needed help. Fear whispered in his mind, warning him of danger in the forest at night, but he pushed it aside. Martin had lived near these woods for years and knew them well. He took a deep breath and moved off the path, stepping between soggy tree trunks, toward where the cries had come. Each footstep sank a little into the soft earth, and he had to shift his balance to avoid slipping over exposed roots. The rain felt colder now, seeping through his coat and chilling him to the bone. Martin called out, his voice hoarse from the wind. "Hello? Are you all right?" He listened, and after a moment, the cries turned to soft sobs. Following the sound, he saw a small figure crouched beside a fallen log. The child was curled into a ball, drenched from head to toe, and his clothes clung to him like a second skin. Mud streaked his cheeks, and his hair was plastered against his forehead. He looked up when Martin approached, eyes wide with fear. Rainwater dripped from his eyelashes. At first, the boy seemed too exhausted to move, but when their eyes met, he whimpered and curled tighter into himself. His backpack lay open a few feet away, and one shoulder strap had snapped under the weight of soaking clothes and sodden supplies. Martin knelt beside the boy, careful to keep his own balance on the slippery ground. He spoke in a calm, gentle tone, even though his heart pounded. "Hey there, son. It's okay. I'm here to help." The boy shivered violently, as if the cold had reached into his bones. Martin unzipped his own coat and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders like a makeshift blanket. The fabric was soaked but still thicker than the boy's sodden shirt. He slipped his arms around the child, lifting him to his feet. The boy weighed almost nothing, too weak from cold and fear to stand on his own. Martin felt the shaking of the boy's body as he lifted him, careful not to jostle him too much. He felt the boy's heart beat rapidly against his chest. Gently, Martin said, "We're going to get you somewhere dry. I'll keep you safe." Carrying the boy through the storm was far from easy. The rain fell so hard that it pounded Martin's coat, running off his hood in rivulets. Pine needles and small branches showered down with the wind, and every now and then a larger branch cracked free, crashing to the ground. Martin's boots squelched in deep puddles, making loud sucking noises with each lift of his foot. At one point, he slipped, twisting his ankle slightly, but he didn't let the boy fall. Instead, Martin braced himself against a nearby tree, took a breath, and continued forward, using the trunk for support. The boy's small arms were wrapped tightly around Martin's neck, head pressed against his shoulder. Martin felt the boy's breathing fast and shallow, and he whispered soft words. "Almost there. You're going to be fine." The path back to the cabin was familiar, but in the storm, even the smallest roots on the trail could trip him. Still, he took deliberate steps, determined to reach shelter. Once he reached the clearing where his cabin sat, Martin carried the boy through the door and into warmth. The difference was immediate. Inside, the air felt drier, though still cool, near the floorboards. Martin set the boy on his feet by the wood stove and moved quickly to kindling a fire. Sparks flew as he struck a match, and soon dry kindling crackled, sending bright flames licking upward. The warmth rushed out, pushing back against the damp chill that clung to Martin's clothes. He reached for the towel he kept hanging beside the stove and wrapped it around the boy, patting like he would soothe a frightened animal. The boy's teeth chattered so hard the sound echoed through the tiny cabin. Martin took off his own coat and draped it over the boy's shoulders before fetching a heavy wool blanket, tucking it around him like a cocoon. The boy sat on the edge of a simple wooden chair, shivering but safe from the storm. Martin knelt in front of him, brushing away muddy strands of hair from the boy's forehead. Water ran down his chin, landing in little puddles on the floor. Martin ran the towel over the boy's arms and legs, removing as much mud and water as possible without removing his wet clothes completely. The boy's hands were bluish, too cold to feel heat right away. Martin knew that hypothermia could set in quickly, especially in children. He fed scraps of dry clothing through the boy's arms, an old t-shirt and a pair of socks he kept reserved for emergencies. Martin pressed them close to the lingering heat from the stove to let them warm before putting them on the boy. He told the boy in a soft voice, "I have dry clothes right here. Just hold on and you'll be warm soon." Once the boy was dressed in the dry clothes, he looked slightly less like a small rag doll. Martin sat on the hearth beside him, the firelight dancing across their faces. He poured warm water into a tin cup and held it to the boy's mouth so he could sip. The water was lukewarm, but it stirred something inside the boy's belly. He gulped it down gratefully, his teeth no longer chattering as much. Martin added a packet of soup mix to boiling water and stirred until it thickened. He spooned the warm broth into the boy's mouth, and the boy leaned forward, drinking carefully, his eyes focused on the bowl. The scent of broth filled the cabin, mixing with the smell of burning wood. Martin knew that food, warmth, and rest would help the boy recover, but he also needed to learn how the child ended up alone in the storm. After the boy had eaten and his body stopped trembling so violently, Martin asked gently, "What's your name?" The boy looked up at him, his eyes achingly weary. He whispered, "Caleb." His voice was small, barely louder than a breath. Martin nodded, offering a small smile. He didn't push for more information too quickly. Instead, he continued to feed Caleb warm soup, allowing him to eat slowly. The boy's hands flexed around the spoon, and his breathing became steadier. Each time Caleb swallowed, the tension in his small shoulders eased a little. Martin set the bowl to the side when Caleb had taken the last spoonful, then reached for a dry blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders again. "You're safe here, Caleb. We'll talk more once you're rested." While Caleb sat in the chair wrapped in blankets, Martin fetched his old radio and tuned it to the local ranger station's frequency. He needed to know if anyone was searching for a lost child. The static crackled before a voice came through, calm but urgent. "This is Ranger Millard at Pine Ridge Station. We are still looking for a missing boy, last seen at Whispering Pines Campground. Any information on whereabouts?" Martin switched off the radio, careful not to scare Caleb with the abrupt sound. He said, "They're looking for someone. You and I need to find out where your family is, but not right now. For now, rest. We'll call them in the morning once it's safe." Caleb nodded slowly, his eyes drifting shut. He leaned against the back of the chair and sleep began to claim him. Outside, the storm continued unabated. The wind rattled the windows and rain drummed on the roof with steady insistence. Occasionally, the lights flickered as the cabin's small generator struggled against the storm. Martin reset the switch each time, making sure the room stayed lit. He sat on the floor beside the chair, placing a hand gently on Caleb's back to ensure he stayed warm. The boy's breathing evened out, and tears left faint tracks on his cheeks. Martin let him sleep, knowing the child needed every moment of rest he could get. Martin used the quiet hours to prepare for what the next hours might bring. He gathered extra blankets and placed them against the back of the chair in case Caleb stirred again with cold. He filled a small basin with hot water in case the boy needed more washing up. He checked his phone for any messages, but the storm had cut off signal to the nearest tower. The only communication option remained the old radio. Martin knew he had to wait until daylight to call the authorities or, better yet, walk Caleb back to the campsite once the roads were clear. Until then, he was content to sit and listen to the storm's fury, thankful that he had found the lost boy in time. In the stillness of the cabin, broken only by the storm's white noise, Martin thought about the dangers Caleb had faced. The cold rain, the darkness, the wolves rumored to prowl at night. He felt relief that those dangers were behind them, at least for now. He kept watch over the boy, not. Martin lifted his coat collar against the biting cold as he helped Caleb settle in front of the stove. The flames licked the metal sides, sending warm air into the small cabin. Caleb's teeth still chattered, and Martin wrapped another blanket around him, tucking it beneath the boy's chin. He led Caleb to a wooden chair placed beside the stove, the kind that had once been part of a school cafeteria set that Martin had repurposed. The chair sat unevenly, one leg shorter than the rest, so Martin slipped a scrap of folded newspaper beneath it. He then knelt in front of the child and gently placed the boy's muddy feet on a folded towel Martin kept for emergencies. Tiny, rivulets of mud-streaked water ran from Caleb's wet boots onto the towel, darkening the fabric with each drop. "Here," Martin said softly, pulling off the boy's wet socks and setting them aside near the stove. He offered Caleb his own pair of thick wool socks which still smelled faintly of smoke and pine. Caleb hesitated before slipping his feet into the warm socks. The boys' soles had gone numb from hours in cold, sodden shoes. Martin rubbed the child's feet through the socks, warming them until the trembling subsided. He spoke in low, reassuring tone so as not to frighten Caleb further. "You're safe now. The fire will warm you and you'll have dry clothes soon." Caleb stared into the flames, his eyes watery and red-rimmed from exhaustion and fear. Martin noticed the boy's small hands clench and unclench as he massaged warmth into them, but Caleb said nothing. The crackling fire was the only sound for a long moment until Martin retrieved a metal basin of hot water he had prepared earlier. He carried it to Caleb's feet and instructed, "Dip your feet in here for a moment, it'll help them thaw." The boy nodded silently and slowly lowered his feet into the basin. Steam rose as the cold, stiff toes met the comfortable heat. Martin held the basin steady, careful not to spill a drop. His gloved fingers gripped the metal's cool edge as he watched Caleb's toes, gradually regaining color. Soon, the boy sighed. A deep, half-awake, half-relieved sound, as if slipping out of a nightmare. Once Caleb's feet felt warm enough, Martin helped him out of the basin, dried them with a fresh towel, and then wrapped them in a clean blanket. The boy leaned back in the chair, eyelids drooping. Martin poured warm water into a chipped tin cup and held it to Caleb's lips, encouraging him to sip. The boy hesitated, then drank slowly, his throat making soft swallowing sounds. Martin smiled and, from his pocket, produced a small packet of instant chicken broth. He mixed it with more hot water, stirring until the pale liquid clouded with savory steam. He held the cup to Caleb's lips again. The child sniffed, then sipped, his body relaxing further as warmth spread inside. Martin watched as Caleb's posture softened. The boy's shoulders no longer shivered so violently. Martin thought of the dangers Caleb had faced, the cold rain, the darkness, the wolves rumored to roam these woods at night. He remembered how, as a child, he too had once been lost, but he had never wandered so far. Now he held a shivering child who might have tired himself beyond recovery if left alone. Martin reached behind the stove and grabbed a stack of neatly folded clothes, a spare flannel shirt, sturdy trousers, and an old but dry jacket. He gently suggested, "I have some dry clothes you can change into if you'd like." Caleb nodded slowly, wincing as he stood. Martin helped him peel off the wet garments, placing each carefully on a line to dry. Then, he handed the boy the dry shirt and trousers, guiding him into them while shielding him from the wind that seeped in every time the door opened. Fully dressed in dry layers, Caleb looked a little less like someone who had almost given up. His hair, plastered to his forehead, was still damp, but his cheeks had lost their ghostly pallor. Martin removed a handkerchief from his pocket and brushed it gently across the boy's brow, wiping away flecks of mud and raindrops. Then he brushed his own sleeves off on his trousers, sat back against the chair, and forced himself to consider the next steps. He knew someone must be searching for Caleb, perhaps calling his name in the forest, panic rising with every passing hour. He reached for his handheld radio, a small, battered device with a single antenna. The rain had knocked out cell phone service back home, so the radio was the only reliable means of communication with the outside world. Martin tuned the dial to the local ranger station's frequency and waited while static crackled in his ear. The storm seemed to intensify as if it knew something important was about to happen. After a few seconds, a calm voice spoke through the static. All units, we are continuing the search for a lost juvenile male, approximately 8 years of age. Last seen near the Whispering Pines campground yesterday afternoon. Please relay any sightings immediately." Martin's breath caught. He switched the radio off before announcing that he had a boy in his cabin. He did not want the radio's signal to harm Caleb's rest or frighten him. He would relay the information in person when morning came. The boy sat still in the chair, eyes closed, breathing deeply. Martin watched him, his brow furrowed with concern. Soon he realized Caleb needed more rest before he could safely walk back to help. The storm was still too strong for any trek across the forest floor. Martin turned a sharp eye toward the windows, noting that the wind pounded against the wood and rattled the glass. Rain pounded the roof in relentless sheets. Martin decided to let Caleb sleep. He draped another blanket over the boy, then moved to stoke the fire one more time, arranging extra logs so that the flames would burn long through the night. He covered the ragged gap around the door with an old quilt, tucking it into the crevice to keep out the draft. He placed a small lantern on the table beside the chair, lighting it so there would be a glimmer of glow if Caleb woke and needed to find his way to the basin or the dry clothes. The rest of the cabin remained in shadow, save for the dancing firelight that cast moving shapes on the log walls. Martin sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the storm's roar. He reflected on how quickly things had changed. Only hours ago he was walking home from work, expecting a simple night by himself. Now there was a lost boy to care for, a search party somewhere out there, and parents growing frantic. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He might be just a janitor, but tonight, he was a guardian. He imagined Caleb's parents calling his name in the dark, their voices cracking with fear. He recalled how, when he was a child, his own mother's voice had comforted him during a thunderstorm. He wanted to give Caleb the same kind of reassurance. Martin stood and checked the stove one more time, ensuring flames were high enough to keep the cabin warm for hours. Then he sat on the edge of his simple bed, folded blankets piled neatly nearby, and removed his wet coat. He shook it once, and a shower of rainwater fell onto the floorboards. He hung it on a hook, then removed his boots and placed them by the door. He changed into a fresh pair of socks and clean trousers he had set aside for emergencies. As he tied his laces, he listened for any sound of movement from Caleb. The boy slept, but occasionally he murmured something under his breath, as if treading through a dream. Martin pulled a blanket from the bed and draped it over his shoulders. He sat near the side of the bed, close enough to stir if Caleb awoke, but far enough that he could rest his own weary eyes. The room was small, just a bed, a single shelf with a few books and a worn rug in front of the hearth, but in the fire's glow, it felt cozy. He stared at the ceiling, where wooden beams loomed overhead, imagining that each beam had once been part of a giant pine rescued from the mountains. He wondered how many storms that cabin had weathered, how many souls had found shelter here. He could almost hear the ghosts of travelers past whispering tales of journeys through the forest. Eventually, Martin's exhaustion overtook him. He lay back, blankets pulled under his chin, and allowed himself to drift toward sleep. The fire sputtered behind him, sending occasional embers up the chimney. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked, under the force of wind, but Martin remained still. He trusted his preparations and the sturdy logs of his cabin. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of Caleb, sleeping soundly, no longer cold, safe under a protective roof. He promised himself he would protect the boy until he was reunited with his family. When Martin awoke, the cabin was quieter. The storm had passed through, leaving behind a soft patter of dripping water on the roof and the occasional creak of settling logs. The lantern had burned low, its dim glow flickering one last time before going out. The fire in the stove burned down to glowing coals radiating gentle warmth. Martin stretched, rubbing his eyes, and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He walked to the stove and scooped glowing embers into a metal bucket, then added fresh logs and stoked the fire until bright flames licked upward. The cabin warmed quickly, and he set a kettle of water on top to heat for morning coffee. Martin glanced at the wooden chair and saw Caleb stirring. The boy's eyes fluttered open, revealing a trace of pink around the edges. He blinked, as if uncertain where he was, then recognition dawned. He sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. Martin carried the tin cup of warm water and offered it to Caleb, who drank eagerly. The morning after the storm, Martin stood quietly near the edge of the road as the rescue team finished their work. Caleb had been safely returned to his parents, and the boy had clung to his father's hand the entire time, not wanting to let go. Martin watched from a distance, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, muddy ground left behind by the rain. The air was filled with quiet voices, hugs, and the sounds of vehicles being packed with supplies. One of the rangers gave Martin a grateful nod and shook his hand. Martin simply nodded back, said a soft, "You're welcome," and turned to begin the walk back to his cabin. As Martin stepped onto the forest path, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, of course. Caleb was safe and no harm had come to him. But there was something else too. A kind of stillness inside him, as though the world had briefly shifted, allowing him to do something bigger than himself. The forest seemed different that morning, quieter, as if even the trees were recovering from the wild storm. Sunlight streamed through the branches in long golden beams. The birds had returned, their chirping soft but constant. Martin walked slowly, taking in the peacefulness that had returned after the storm's fury. Back in his cabin, Martin returned to his usual chores. He washed the towels and blankets used for Caleb, scrubbed the muddy footprints off the wooden floor, and hung the boys' damp clothes by the fireplace to dry in case they were ever needed again. The cabin felt empty now, but not in a sad way, more like how a book feels after the last chapter is finished. Martin brewed a pot of coffee and sat near the fire, staring into the flames. He thought about the moment he had found Caleb in the woods, the weight of the boy in his arms, the way the child had looked up at him with frightened eyes. That memory stayed with him like a photograph in his mind. Over the next few days, Martin returned to work at the high school. Everything there was just as it had been before the storm. Classrooms filled with desks, walls covered in old posters, and lockers that squeaked when opened. The other janitors gave him small nods of respect, as if they now saw him differently. A few teachers smiled at him more often, and one even brought him a cup of tea during a late-night shift. But Martin didn't speak much about what had happened. He never liked being the center of attention. What mattered to him was that Caleb was safe, and that was enough. One chilly morning, a few days after the storm had passed, Martin heard a loud sound echoing through the valley. At first he thought it might be thunder again, but when he stepped outside, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A red and white helicopter was flying low over the forest, its blades chopping the air with a deep rhythmic roar. Martin shaded his eyes and watched as the aircraft slowed, circled above, and gently descended into the small clearing just a few feet from his cabin. The wind from the rotors bent the tops of the grass and sent leaves flying in all directions. Martin stepped back as the helicopter touched down. Dust and pine needles swirled around him. When the rotors slowed, the door opened and out stepped a man in a dark jacket, followed by a woman in a neat suit. Behind them, Caleb's parents climbed down carefully, their eyes searching the area until they found Martin standing just beside the steps of his cabin. Caleb followed behind them, clutching a stuffed bear and wearing a large coat that didn't quite fit. His eyes lit up when he saw Martin. Without waiting, Caleb rushed forward and threw his arms around Martin's waist. The hug was strong and full of feeling. Martin knelt and hugged the boy back, patting his back gently. "I missed you," Caleb whispered. Martin smiled and said softly, "I'm glad to see you again." The boy's mother stepped forward next, her eyes filled with emotion. She held out her hand but then changed her mind and hugged Martin too. "We couldn't leave the country before thanking you in person," she said. "We owe you more than we can say." Caleb's father, tall and serious-looking, came forward and introduced himself as Dr. Richard Turner. He explained that he was a pediatric surgeon who had returned from overseas as soon as he heard his son had gone missing. "I couldn't think straight knowing he was lost in a forest storm," he said, "and when we learned a kind stranger had saved him, we knew we had to meet you face to face." He opened a leather case and handed Martin a carefully folded piece of paper. It was a letter from the county sheriff's department, officially commending Martin for his actions. Alongside it was a simple wooden box. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a silver pocket watch with an engraving on the back. To Martin, Caldwell, with endless gratitude. Martin was surprised. He turned the watch over in his hand, reading the message again. He wasn't used to being recognized for anything, let alone receiving gifts. "This isn't necessary," he said softly. "I was just doing what anyone would do." Dr. Turner shook his head. "You may think that, but most people wouldn't have gone out into a storm. You gave us back our son." Caleb tugged on Martin's sleeve. "Can I come visit again sometime?" he asked. Martin chuckled. "Only if you bring good weather," he replied. Everyone laughed. The mood had become lighter and the warmth between them felt real and honest. The Turners didn't stay long. They had a flight to catch, and the helicopter was on a schedule. Before leaving, Caleb ran back and pressed something into Martin's hand. A hand-drawn picture of a cabin, a tall man and a small boy standing beside a fire. "This is us," Caleb said proudly. Martin folded the picture carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. When the helicopter lifted off, Martin stood outside, waving as the wind whipped around him. He watched it rise into the sky and disappear over the trees. Then he turned back to his cabin, still holding the watch in one hand and Caleb's drawing in the other. The forest was calm again, the sky wide and blue. Martin walked back inside and placed the watch on a small shelf above the fireplace, right next to an old photo of his grandparents. Then he pinned the drawing to the wall, using a rusty nail that had once held a forgotten calendar. That evening, Martin sat by the fire with a quiet heart. He sipped his tea and stared at the watch, listening to its soft ticking. He thought about how life could surprise you when you least expected it. One moment, you're sweeping classroom floors and stacking chairs. The next, you're holding a lost child through a storm and receiving visitors by helicopter. Yet even with all the noise and change, Martin felt something deeper, a steady sense of purpose like a quiet stream that keeps flowing no matter how wild the weather gets. Outside the cabin, the forest was peaceful. A few deer wandered through the clearing, pausing to nibble at the grass. Birds settled into their nests, and as the stars blinked into view above the pines, Martin leaned back in his chair and smiled. He didn't need applause or headlines. He had done what was right, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed the helicopter visit, Martin's life slowly returned to its usual quiet rhythm. The forest around his cabin was still and peaceful, the air crisp and cool as summer faded into early autumn. The leaves on the trees began to change from deep green to soft gold and warm orange. Martin chopped firewood during the mornings, swept the porch clean of fallen leaves in the afternoon, and returned to his night shift at the high school without much fanfare. But even as things went back to normal on the outside, something inside, Martin had changed. Each time he looked at the silver pocket watch sitting on the shelf above the fireplace, he felt a quiet warmth rise in his chest. The watch wasn't flashy. It didn't shine too brightly or tick too loudly, but it meant something to him. It was a reminder that kindness, even when no one is watching, could leave a mark on the world. And the hand-drawn picture from Caleb, now, pinned to the wall beside the window, was another reminder. Every time he saw the two smiling stick figures beside a campfire under a starry sky, Martin smiled. Though Martin had always been a quiet man, people around town began to look at him a little differently. When he walked into the general store on Sundays, the clerk would smile and chat a bit longer than usual. The local librarian set aside books about survival and mountain trails just for him. A few high school students even waved when they saw him in the hallways, calling him Mr. Martin with a new sense of respect. He didn't talk much about what had happened, but somehow everyone seemed to know. News like that had a way of spreading in a small town, especially when it was a story with a good ending. One afternoon, Martin received a letter in the mail. It had no return address, just his name written in neat handwriting. Inside was a simple card from Caleb. It said, "Thank you for saving me. I still think about the fire and the soup and your stories. I hope I can come visit again. Your friend, Caleb." Martin read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a small box where he kept his most important things: old photos, notes from his grandparents, and now this letter. Caleb's words echoed in his heart, not because they were fancy or dramatic, but because they were real, honest. In a world full of noise and hurry, Martin had done something that mattered. He had simply listened, helped, and stayed. And for a little boy lost in a storm, that had been everything. One clear Saturday morning, Martin went for a walk through the woods, following the same trail he had taken on the night of the storm. The trees had grown denser, and the path was covered with fallen pine needles. He stopped at the spot where he had first heard Caleb's voice calling out from the darkness. Standing there now, with sunlight filtering through the branches, It was hard to believe how dangerous and frightening it had been that night. But Martin remembered it clearly. He could still hear the wind howling, the rain hitting the leaves, and the sound of Caleb's cries blending into the storm. Martin knelt beside the fallen log where Caleb had crouched, shivering and soaked. He reached out and touched the bark, rough and damp from morning dew. He stayed there for a while, listening to the breeze whisper through the trees. Then he stood, brushed off his hands, and continued his walk. It felt like the forest was quieter now. Like it, too, remembered the boy and the storm and the rescue. Later that week, the school where Martin worked held a small assembly. It wasn't something grand or fancy, just a gathering in the gym with teachers, students, and some townsfolk who had come to show support. The principal stood on stage and thanked Martin for his courage. They presented him with a plaque that read, "To Martin Caldwell, for quiet. Bravery and kindness in the storm." The crowd clapped politely, and Martin gave a small nod, accepting the honor with quiet grace. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. That evening after the event, Martin returned home and hung the plaque near the door where he could see it each time he stepped outside. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat near the fireplace, watching the flames dance behind the stoves. Glass. Outside, the sky darkened and the stars began to appear one by one. He thought about Caleb again, wondered if he was asleep, safe in his bed, dreaming of forests and fires and maybe even their cabin adventure. Martin hoped the boy was doing well in school and staying close to his parents. He also thought about how that one night had changed so much. He had always believed that life would pass by quietly, that his days would be filled with simple tasks and peaceful walks. But now he understood that even the quietest lives could hold great meaning. You didn't have to be a soldier, a scientist, or a leader to do something important. Sometimes, all it took was listening to a voice in the dark and deciding not to walk away. From then on, Martin started leaving a little extra water and food in his emergency box just in case. He kept a second set of warm clothes near the door, not because he expected something to happen again, but because he knew it could. And he wanted to be ready, just as he had been that night. He also made a new habit. Once a month, no matter the weather, Martin would light a small fire in the clearing outside his cabin. He'd bring out a chair, a blanket, and a tin cup of tea, and he'd sit under the stars for an hour or so. Sometimes he'd speak aloud, just small thoughts or memories. Sometimes he said nothing at all. It became his way of remembering, of honoring that stormy night and the boy who had trusted him in the dark. The forest has always listened. Years passed. Seasons came and went. The school changed principals, the town built new houses, and the forest trails grew deeper with new growth. But Martin remained at his cabin, tending to his routines and living with quiet pride. People still remembered the story of the janitor who saved a lost boy during a storm. It was told at school events and sometimes whispered at the general store to newcomers. But Martin didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as someone who had been in the right place at the right time and chose to act. One winter, as snow fell gently over the forest, Martin received a surprise visitor. A young teenager stepped into the clearing, now taller and older, but with the same warm eyes. It was Caleb. He was 13 now, carrying a small backpack and a bigger smile. "I wanted to see the cabin again," he said. Martin opened the door wide and welcomed him inside. They sat by the fire just like before, sharing tea and stories. Caleb looked around and pointed to the picture he had drawn years earlier, still pinned to the wall. "You kept it," he said with a grin. Martin nodded. "Of course I did. Some things are worth keeping forever." And as the snowflakes fell softly outside, the two sat in the glow of the fire, one older, one growing, and talked long into the night. No thunder, no wind, no fear, just warmth, memory, and the quiet connection between a boy and the man who had once held his hand through the storm.